So, this is the last section of the last lecture, the end. What I want to do in this section of the lecture is two main things. First of all, I just want to take the opportunity to respond to a few points that have been brought up in the discussion forum discussions. And then at the end I want to say some thank yous. So I'm going to start off by talking about 4 points which have been brought up in the discussion forum. Now, there's many points I have to say that I could have discussed, but I've chosen 4 that I think illustrate various points that I felt it was useful or important to say something more about. The first point I want to make is actually a point that has come up very recently on the discussion forum. This is a point about the determinants of human well-being. And this is really a point about perspective. In the course, of course, we've had a very large focus on economy, on economic development, and on the influence of economic development on human well-being. And I guess I just wanted to come back to say there's nothing in that focus that's intended to say that the only thing that matters for human well-being is economic development. Of course, I have argued strongly that economic development is one of the key influences on human well-being, and talked in terms of, well, if there's an improvement in GDP per capita or an improvement in living standards that come from that, say through higher life expectancy, better healthcare, higher standards of literacy or education, then we should think of that improvement, which is coming from an improvement in economic development, as mattering for human well-being. But of course, human well-being is much broader than that. And there's a quote from John Maynard Keynes that I really like, which Sylvia Nasar quotes, which says, the political problem of what we might say today would be humankind, how to combine 3 things: economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. And so our focus has been mainly on this part, economic efficiency, how to improve material well-being. We've said a little bit about social justice to the extent that we've talked about the degree of inequality in the distribution of income. But of course, social justice is much broader than that. And we haven't said too much about individual liberty. So by this, I'm not being critical of the material we've covered in the course either. I think because economic efficiency is one of the big drivers of human well-being, it's really important to have a thorough understanding of how economic efficiency, economic development affects human well-being. But the point is more to say, look, it's important to recognise that if our starting point is to be thinking about human well-being, we also have to think about economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. And so if we want to understand the whole set of events that occur in the world, then we need to understand that individuals, groups in society are going to be motivated not just by economic development, but also by concerns about social justice and in individual liberty. So really what I'm doing here is trying to tell you where I think the story of economic development fits into the bigger story of human well-being. That it's one really important contributing factor to human well-being. It's a factor that's been incredibly important in generating changes in human well-being in many parts of the world in the last 250 years. But if we want to understand the whole of history, we have to understand that there are other factors that motivate individuals and groups in society. So it's a matter of perspective. The second point I want to talk about, which is a bit of a change of gear, is about interpreting some of the graphs that I've used in the course. And this is a point about correlation versus causality. At various points I've used graphs like this one, which is a graph you might remember that shows the GDP per capita from 1970 to 2010 of 12 countries in Africa which had 0 slaves taken from them during the period when the Atlantic slave trade was happening, and the 10 highest slave countries. And this was a graph that I argued showed that the experience of slavery in Africa had long-term consequences. That if you look even back in 1970, the GDP per capita in the high slave countries is about half that in the low slave countries. And then it's really only the high slave countries that have experienced growth in GDP in this period after 1970, when there has been some pickup in the rate of economic growth in Africa. And so I argued, look, this shows that the experience of slavery has had long-lasting effects. As some of you pointed out, really when you look at a graph like this, there's nothing to establish that there is in fact a causal relation between being a 0 slave and a high slave country and the level of economic development. As it's presented here, the information's really only telling you that there's a correlation, that, well, high slave countries had lower level of economic development, and low slave countries had a higher level of economic development. It's not really telling us about what caused there to be that association between the level of economic development and the extent to which there was involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. So first of all, that's an important point to make, that when you look at a graph like this and you see, wow, there seems to be an association between 0 slave and high slave, you can't immediately think that that's representing a causal relationship, that it's actually being 0 or high slave that's causing the difference in GDP per capita. There could be some other factor that's causing that difference. For example, maybe it's the fact that 0 slave countries were more developed even before slavery happened. Maybe they've got richer natural resources, and so that's what explains the difference, rather than the fact that one of the regions experienced slavery, extensive slavery, and the other regional countries didn't experience that. So it's always important with a graph like this to delve deeper and ask, well, is there really a causal relationship between, for example, the slavery and the level of economic development? And in all of the graphs that I have presented, there's always been that causal relation in the research that underlies the graph. So when I presented a graph like this and argued that, look, this shows that there's a relationship between slavery and economic development, even though that might not automatically flow from the graph, it's always been the case that there's some research underlying the graph which does establish the causal relationship. For example, as I described on the discussion forum when the issue about this graph came up, Nathan Nunn, who did this research, he really has two approaches to establishing the idea that this is a causal relationship. One way is to try and rule out all of the other potential explanations for this relationship apart from the slavery relationship. So he, for example, looks at indicators of population density prior to the commencement of the slave trade in the regions that subsequently had high and low slavery, to look at the question of whether it might be that, well, look, it's just that the 0 slave regions were richer all the time, and that's why they're richer after slavery. And what he finds, in fact, is really the opposite, that the regions that had 0 slaves taken from them look like they were in fact poorer regions before slavery happened than the regions that the slaves were taken from. So Nathan Nunn does a variety of exercises to establish that other factors that you might have thought could be a basis for this causal relation, for this association in the data, don't seem to fit. And so that then provides one piece of evidence that look, slavery is the thing that's remaining that appears to be a potential explanation for the association between slavery and the level of economic development. The second thing that he does then is to say, well, look, if you're arguing that there's this causal relationship between slavery and economic development, you should be able to suggest some way, some mechanism by which slavery is causing this lower level of economic development. And so what he's done in a little bit in his original paper on this, but also in subsequent research, is to show that you can establish a linkage between the extent of slavery and the extent of trust that exists within societies today. And so here what's being said is that low slave regions have higher levels of trust within them today, and the high slave regions have lower level of trust. And trust then is a factor which we usually think of as being important for the extent to which, for example, individuals or groups within a population are willing to trade with each other. So this is a second way of establishing that there's this causal relationship, saying, look, if it's causal, there has to be some mechanism by which slavery is affecting economic development. And so what Nathan Nunn's doing is arguing that yes, there is a causal mechanism. It's the idea that what slavery did was really disrupt the personal relationships within particular regions because of the practice of slavery, that usually within those regions it would be one ethnic group enslaving another ethnic group. And that what that did is it created long-lasting differences in levels of trust, which then are a factor that affect economic development today. So, just to summarise, my point here was to say that I've presented a whole variety of graphs to try and establish different points about the sources of economic development. There's been a few posts which have correctly pointed out that, well, look, just on the basis of your graph, you can't really say that that's establishing a causal relationship. What it's establishing is that there's a statistical association, and so that's completely correct. But the point I want to make is on every occasion when I've presented a graph like this, there's always been research underpinning it to establish that yes, that it really is right to think of this as a causal relationship. For example, in the case of this graph, Nathan Nunn having done the research to rule out other potential explanations and to say that there appears to be a plausible mechanism by which slavery would have affected economic development. That's the extent of trust in a society. The third point I wanted to make was about the cost of adjustment. So this was really a point where I felt like, in a way, it's about a cost of development that I felt like, based on a couple of points that people have raised in the discussion forum, I might not have emphasised enough. So in talking about economic development, in particular the idea that there were followers who could catch up and converge towards leaders, I put a lot of emphasis on one of the ways in which that would happen, being that countries which had been primarily agricultural economies would transfer their workforce towards being industrial, and that if it was the case that workers in industry have higher productivity in industry than workers in agriculture, then by shifting a worker from agriculture to industry, then you're increasing the productivity of the economy as a whole, because you're taking a worker who might have been producing $100 worth of output to a worker who's producing $300 worth of output. So you're raising the GDP and the GDP in per capita in the country. And I feel that when I talked about that process, I've described it as a process that would almost happen instantly and automatically. But of course, it's important to note that there have been significant costs associated with that structural adjustment. It's not usually the case that it needn't always be the case that it's the workers who are in the agricultural sector who've gone to be the workers in industry. Often it's involved, for example, unemployment being created in the rural sector. Sometimes it's involved unemployment being created in the urban industrial sector, because you get so many workers seeing the potential benefits of flowing towards the urban industrial sector that there can be unemployment in those regions as well. So, or in the industrial sector as well. So the point here is that an important source of economic development I've talked about is this idea that we get structural adjustment workers shifting from agriculture to industry, and I just want to make the point that that hasn't historically usually been a costless process. That, for example, it's often involved some degree of unemployment occurring as part of that structural adjustment. It can also involve significant social, personal type costs. If you think about the migration that's occurring in China at the moment from rural areas to the city, often that involves a parent leaving a child with grandparents to look after that child while they move to urban areas to take jobs that are going to be higher paid than jobs they can get in rural areas. So to improve the economic well-being of their family, they're taking that job, but at some personal cost. So it's important, I think, to make some mention of the costs that have generally been incurred in the process of adjustment when you're moving from a less developed to a more developed economy. Fourth point I want to take up is about political economy. There's been a lot of discussion of institutions and what we should think of institutions, their role in economic development and policy making, and when you get good policies and bad policies. And I just wanted to give you my schema for thinking about institutional quality and policy making. And I really have a three-phase way of thinking about this. I think about a country, for example, starting out with institutions that might be on a spectrum from low quality to high quality. And I think of that institutional quality of then translating into the motivation that policymakers are going to have. So thinking back to the first section of this lecture, I talked about the idea that what matters about institutions is whether they provide state capacity, and then whether they are causing policymakers to act in the public interest. And so here I'm taking state capacity as a given, and I'm saying, look, if you have low quality institutions, then what's likely is that you're going to get policies made where mainly those policies are going to be in the private interest of the policymakers. So I've done this triangle shape to show that sort of the highest frequency of policies are policies that are going to be in the private interest of policymakers. Whereas if you have high quality institutions, those are institutions that force policymakers to more act in the interest of the general population. So if you have high quality institutions, then you get a much higher frequency of policies being in the public interest. So what I'm representing here is you can think of a spectrum of policies which are in up this end, the policies are completely in the interest of the policymakers. Up this end, they're completely in the public interest. And so if you've got low quality institutions, then the motivation that underlies policy making is going to be predominantly private interest. If you've got high quality institutions, then in my way of thinking, what that's doing is it's really directing policymakers to have to act in the public interest. So you predominantly get policies being made reflecting the public interest. And that then just translates into the quality of policy making. If policies are mainly being made in the private interest, then you're mainly going to get, and so here I'm judging the quality of policy making on a spectrum from low quality to high quality. If policies are mainly being made with the motivation of private interest of the policymakers, then you are mainly going to get low quality policies being made. Whereas if you've got policymakers acting in the public interest, then you are mainly going to get policies made that are in the public interest, that are high quality. So remember, I've said I'm thinking about the quality of policy making in the extent to which policies benefit the public interest or benefit the general population. So with my schema, the idea is that institutional qualities determines the extent to which policymakers are motivated to act in the public interest or in their own private interest, and their motivation is then going to determine the quality of policies, the extent to which policies benefit the general population, or the extent to which they benefit the private interest of the policy makers. So you could think about security of property rights, security of ownership of natural resources. We talked about cases where institutional quality is low, where, for example, all the power resides with an elite oligarchy. In that case, you're going to get policies mainly being made in the private interest, and in that case, you're going to get natural resources being utilised in a way that a lot of the benefit goes to, for example, the elite group in society, rather than generating policies that are going to benefit the general population. Whereas if you have high quality institutions, then policymakers act in the public interest, and then if you have, for example, a natural resource, they're more likely to implement policies that collect revenue from that natural resource and use that for policies such as public education and infrastructure that are going to benefit the general population. So one point I'm trying to make with this schema is that there's a flow from the quality of institutions to the quality of policy making, and that flow is via the motivation of policymakers. The second point I want to make here, though, is that I've drawn triangles here. I haven't just drawn a big point here and a big point here saying, well, if the institutional qualities are low, then it means people only act in private interest, and then all the policies are really low. And in fact, you get a spread of, even if you have institutional quality that's low, there are going to be some well-intentioned policymakers in countries with poor institutions who still end up with a good still end up motivated to make policies in the public interest, and who still end up making policies that have a reasonable degree of public interest. Even if we have high quality institutions, then we're not always going to get perfect policies in the public interest. Sometimes, even with high quality institutions, there's scope for policymakers to act in their private interest. For example, to do things that are going to benefit them electorally. And that would then be associated with policies that were of somewhat lower quality than if they were acting, the policymakers were acting purely in the public interest. So, for example, some of you have pointed out in the discussion forum that even in democratic countries, which we might think of as in many regards having high quality institutions, we still see lots of examples of poor quality policies. And that's because high quality institutions still allow to some degree policymakers to act in private interest, to try and ensure, for example, that they're getting re-elected, or provide benefits towards constituencies who might have supported them in electoral campaigns, for example. So my second point is that while there might be a correlation, and quite a strong correlation, between institutional quality and quality of policy making, it's not to say that you can't have poor policies, you can't have policymakers acting in private interest in economies with good institutions. It isn't to say that you can't have good policies made in countries with poor institutions. Of course, the other element that contributes to this is just a lack of knowledge about what constitutes good policy. You could have a well-motivated policymaker in a country with high-quality institutions who simply, for a lack of knowledge, ends up implementing a policy that that we'd regard as, after we get the chance to observe the effect of that policy, as low quality, or having an adverse effect on public interest or the general population. So there's been a lot of discussion about institutions, effect on policies, why we see good qualities, why we see bad qualities, and so I just wanted to give you my schema for thinking about that. And it's really a schema that says, look, there's going to be a correlation between the quality of institutions and quality of policy making. That's because of the effect institutions have on the motivation of policy makers, but that correlation is not perfect. even in places with poor institutions, for example, you can get well-motivated policymakers who implement good policies, and sometimes policymakers just don't know what the good policies are. Okay, so we've come to the final slide, and so I've got a whole lot of thank yous. First of all, thanks to all of you. Thanks to everyone who's participated in the course in any way, whether that's watching the videos, whether it's completing the assessment exercises and doing the peer reviews as well. Thanks very much. Your participation obviously has been really important to the subject, and so thanks for that, and thanks for by your involvement making it possible for other students to have the experience in the subject as well. Of course, the group of people in the course who I've interacted with most directly are those of you who've participated on the discussion forum. And I know as well some of you have participated on Facebook and Twitter, and that Steph's been involved in moderating those discussions, so I'm also including you in these remarks. The participation in the discussion forum has been fantastic. I really want to thank, I'm not going to name names, but I really want to thank those of you who have put up resources for other students to look at that relate to the material we've been covering in the course. I really want to thank those of you who have been so generous and helpful in answering questions from other people in the course. That's been hugely helpful for making the course a productive learning experience. I want to thank everyone who's participated in the discussion forum in any way. Posing a question that someone else then gets to think about and to answer is really helping them think about the material. Those of you who've created groups in the same country who then are able to talk about the experience of economic development in your country, thanks to you as well. From a personal perspective, I really want to say thanks for your contributions through the forum to making it such a brilliant learning experience for me. So I've really appreciated the feedback that some of you have provided about presentation. I've really appreciated the suggestions for resources you've made. I've got a huge file where I've noted down all those suggestions, and you can be very confident that a lot of the resources that you've suggested are going to find their way into my teaching on world economic history in various ways and at various points. I also want to thank you for when you've raised questions about the material in the subject, and that's at different levels, where you've raised questions about particular graphs, or where you've raised questions about the explanation for particular arguments, or whether you've asked whether there might be other ways of thinking about those issues. It's really been invaluable for developing and promoting my thinking about those issues and topics that you've asked about, and has really given me a much richer understanding of the material. And it hasn't just been on the particular points to do with one argument or one graph. It's also been the really global discussions that you've been having about what matters in economic development. That's really been a great experience for me as well, to get to read that material. So the summary message is thank you very much for participating in the subject. Thanks to those of you who have participated in the forum for making it a great experience for your fellow students, but also for making it such a great learning experience for me. I've also got to thank the team that I've been very lucky to have involved with me here at University of Melbourne in developing the subject. First of all, Peter, who many of you will have seen posting on the discussion forum. That's just a tiny bit of the job that he's done in this course. He's been responsible for the design of the website, the placement of all materials, He's done a brilliant job with that. He added a lot of extra touches to that I think really made it a lot easier to navigate between the different types of materials that we've had and make it really functional to get to those materials. So thanks very much, Peter. Thanks to Steph, who some of you also will have interacted with as the TA in the subject. Steph's been really valuable in giving me feedback on a lot of the assessment materials and some of the extra learning activities, and of course in participating in the discussion forum. Steph's been involved with me for a couple of years in TAing the subject I teach at University of Melbourne, so it's been great to have her involved in this version of the subject. I want to thank Astrid, who's the person in the copyright office here at University of Melbourne, who's been ensuring that all the materials that we put up in the course, and in particular the materials that I've used in the lecture overheads, are copyright compliant. There's been a vast amount of different materials that she's had to check over, and so yeah, I really appreciate all the effort that she's put in to the course in making sure that it is copyright compliant, and assisting with finding extra materials when sometimes the materials that I thought I could put up turned out to be not copyright compliant. So thanks to Astrid, and I know there's been a couple of other people involved in the copyright office with her, so thanks to them as well. Thanks to Seth. So Seth, some of you will have interacted with on the discussion forum. He has been providing technical assistance on the discussion forum, providing technical assistance on the website, but he's also done a brilliant job in sourcing the links for a lot of the readings that I've put up. When I put up those suggested readings, originally it was my intention that we probably wouldn't really be able to link to them, but that it was important for you to know what I thought some of the key references and readings were, and to be able to search for them maybe after the subject, the course had finished. But Seth's been able to provide links to a huge amount of that material for you, and so I think I know some of you have been able to look at some of that material, so it's been valuable to you now. If you haven't then been able to look at it during the course, then those links are still there for you to look at before the course closes, to maybe make a note and see what the links are to some materials that you would like to read. Eileen. So Eileen's the person who, you've never seen her, but through every one of the lectures when you've been watching me, she's been sitting here in the same room doing the filming. She's done a brilliant job being patient with me. I guess some of you might have recorded to camera before, and if you have, you know, I think it's a bit of a different experience. When I started out, it's quite confronting talking to a camera rather than an audience, and as well, you sort of feel like, well, this is for posterity, this is sort of on film so that it has to be perfect. And so I know that especially at the start, I was rather ragged in a variety of ways, and Eileen has put up with that with very good humour. And not only that, she's obviously done a brilliant job integrating the material together, my talking and the slides, to create the high quality video lectures that I know a lot of you have commented on the discussion forum. So I really appreciate the fantastic job that Eileen's done in putting together that material. Then everyone else involved, Deb, everyone else in the e-learning team who's had a role in the subject, thank you very much. I appreciate very much your assistance as well. So that's the end of my thank yous. Thank you again to you all, and yeah, I really hope that doing this subject will be the starting point for you in, well, I know a lot of you already understood obviously a lot about economic development before. For those of you, if this is the first experience, then I really hope it's a starting point for continuing to learn more about world development experience of your country. For those of you who knew a lot before, then I hope it sort of stimulated maybe a few different directions of thought. Thanks.